In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols built the largest land empire in human history. At its furthest extent, the Mongolian Empire stretched from the coast of China along the northern border of the Himalayas, covering much of today's Middle East, from Persia to the Black Sea, much of south-central Russia and Ukraine, and Europe to the gates of Vienna. This was achieved by foot, wagon, and most famously, horseback. By the time the Mongols reached the eastern borders of Ukraine in the late 1200s, some of their armies numbered 100,000. But it wasn't their numbers that were the Mongols' main weapon. Terror was. That policy of terror began with their first great leader, the infamous Genghis Khan. He is not infamous everywhere. The Great Khan, as he is also known, remains a national hero in Mongolia today. If you're interested in more topics like this, please like and subscribe to our channel and hit the notification button to see more brutal and unusual content. Khan means ruler or chieftain, and Genghis Khan means a universal ruler. The Mongolians ruled such a vast empire that the name is barely an exaggeration. Even before Genghis ascended to the leadership of all the Mongol tribes, Mongol society was a brutal one. Like the Vikings on the other side of the globe, the Mongolians were often known for the brutal murders of their kin, especially when it came to the ruling class or those who wanted to rule. Eliminating all other lines of one's family ensured that their children would inherit their positions and power. Genghis's real name was Temujin, which means of iron. Like a certain Soviet leader some 700 years later, Temujin needed to be made of iron to survive. Unlike Stalin, Temujin killed his first person at age 14, and that was his half-brother. Many stories about this episode have it that Genghis's older half-brother Better stole a fish that Temujin had killed for the night's meal and ate it all himself, refusing to share with his family. Soon after, Temujin secretly followed Better, waiting for him to be alone, and then shot him with one of the famous Mongol recurved bows. Another version of the story adds that Better, as the oldest brother, began to order people around, which caused resentment from Temujin and his younger full brother Khwarazm. There may or may not have been food involved, but in this version, Temujin simply used Better's greed as an excuse to kill him and moved to take control of the clan himself. This was not unexpected or unusual. When the death of Better reached the boy's mother, she basically gave her murderous son a scolding. Life was hard in the time of Genghis Khan, who lived from around 1162 to 1215 AD. Genghis did not become the Khan of all the Mongols until he was about 44 years old, but by the age of 20 he was an up-and-coming military leader in command of his own clan army. One of the first things he did with that army was to seek revenge for his father's murder. You'd better get used to it. There's an awful lot of murder in the life of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. Temujin's father was killed by a group of Tatars who have an unfortunate history. They were driven west by the Mongols, settled in southern Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea, and were deported en masse by Stalin for their refusal to follow his dictates to his liking. Hundreds of years before, they got on the wrong side of another dictator, Genghis Khan, whose father had been poisoned by the Tatars at a wedding. 11 years later, Temujin cornered the main Tatar army and camp, slaughtering many in battle, taking thousands of prisoners, men, women, and children, as collective punishment for the murder of his father, Yasuge. Genghis ordered that all people over a certain age be killed. To illustrate what he meant, he strolled over to a wagon and marked the height on a wheel, 3 feet. Everyone was killed except some young children and infants. Yes, there used to be pyramids in China. They were built, so to speak, by the Mongolians as a lesson for all who thought about opposing them. The Mongol pyramids were erected by order of Genghis Khan in 1215 and were built outside the city of Beijing after a 3-year Mongol siege. Genghis's siege caused the people of Beijing to turn to cannibalism to survive. They likely wouldn't have survived anyway, for Genghis put tens of thousands of them to death. Travelers and diplomats who saw them swore they saw pyramids in the distance. They were indeed pyramids of human skulls, perhaps 50 feet high or more, and there were many of them. During Genghis's life and after, the Mongols followed a regular pattern when approaching an enemy city. They would send an offer along with a warning which essentially said, "Surrender, and you will be relatively unharmed. Resist, and we will kill you all." It's estimated that just during Genghis's life and his time at the top, which was relatively short, between 5 to 10% of the world's population was killed or died as a result of his campaigns. Remember, the Mongols traveled on horseback, and their main weapons were the sword and the bow. This was bloody, face-to-face slaughter. The female black widow spider eats the male after they mate. In a very similar way, the daughters of Genghis Khan played Black Widow to those they were married off to. Marriage among the ruling Mongols and their allies and enemies of the steppes is very similar to what you might have read about medieval Europe. Daughters were commodities. They could be married off to cement relations between allies or bring an end to war. In the case of Genghis's many daughters, they could end a dynasty and begin another one. To marry into the family of the great Khan conferred prestige and power on the groom and his family. Usually, this power and prestige were short-lived, for as payment for marrying into Genghis's family, a tribal ruler had to get rid of all his other wives. It would be Genghis's line that inherited the throne. There could be no competition. The groom was then promoted to high command in the front lines, where almost all of them were killed. So who would rule until her sons were old enough? Genghis's daughters. With each death, Genghis's empire expanded, and no one was under any illusion who his daughters took their orders from. The Khwarazm people lived in the area north of today's Iran and just south of the Aral Sea for a time. Before the rise of Genghis, they had a powerful and advanced empire in the area. What remains of their civilization shows advanced architectural and mathematical skills. Unfortunately for the Khwarazm, that's about all that's left. You know, Genghis Khan. When the Khan's armies approached the capital of Khwarazm, he behaved peacefully and sent a delegation to negotiate with his adversaries. The Khwarazm made a bad choice. They beheaded the Mongol diplomats, fearing a ruse. Then they made their problem even worse, if that's even possible, with Genghis Khan at your gates. The Khwarazm then killed another group of Mongols sent to find an agreement. As you can probably guess, this did not sit well with Temujin, aka Genghis Khan. He sent an army of 200,000 men, and they killed everyone they could find. Then he ordered his soldiers to destroy, erase, all the Khwarazm castles, farms, fortresses, houses, and everything else. The Mongols missed a couple of remote mosques, but for all intents and purposes, the Khwarazm were made extinct. Their bones were even ground into dust. When the Mongols advanced again sometime later, he even ordered a river diverted to cover up all traces of the Khwarazm. Generally, making a bad decision when dealing with the Great Khan was not something you survived. One of those who learned that lesson the hard way, and really, was there any other way, were the Shashia people who roamed the steppes near the borders of Khwarazm. The Shashia had been conquered by the Mongols, and Genghis Khan expected them to send troops to help destroy the Khwarazm, which they did not. Soon after Genghis recognized their disobedience, he sent an army to deal with the Shashia, and every last one was killed. Every last one. Actually, people wouldn't have even known of the Shashia if stories of them hadn't been kept alive in the oral histories of the surrounding people. So many people were killed that the Shashia language was extinguished for several hundred years before historians found carved stones from a language they did not recognize. After careful study, they realized that the only traces left of a once flourishing culture were a few carved rocks. The Shashia might have gotten the final revenge, however, for during this battle Genghis Khan was thrown from his horse and died from his injuries in 1215. Genghis's body was taken back to his homelands to be buried. He was reportedly buried with so much treasure that nations would have been interested in finding the site. Historians today believe that it's more likely that he was buried in a traditional, simple Mongol grave, so no one would be tempted to desecrate the grave of the mightiest conqueror the world had ever seen. What's more, Every man who witnessed or knew the location of the grave was also killed. So no one could be sure where the grave was. Mongols have a belief that someday the Khan of Khans will rise again and lead them to greatness if the grave remains undisturbed. We hope you enjoyed these ruthless and grisly tales from the life of Genghis Khan. If you did and want to see similar content, please like this video and subscribe to our growing channel.